Jake Martinez sat in the far corner of the cantina, his fingers wrapped around a glass of cheap whiskey. The liquid burned going down, but it was nothing compared to what he had felt before. Around him, the sounds of laughter and boasting filled the air. Young alien soldiers from different worlds were telling stories about their great battles and victories. The cantina on Station Kepler 7 was always busy at this time of night. It was the only place where soldiers from all over the galaxy could sit together and drink. The lights were dim, and the air smelled of different alien foods and drinks. Jake preferred it this way. He could sit quietly and watch without anyone bothering him. At the table nearest to him, 3 Vorthak soldiers were talking loudly. Their green scaly skin caught the light as they moved their hands to show how they had fought on the gas giant of Nexus Prime. Their yellow eyes glowed with excitement as they described how they had jumped from floating platform to floating platform while shooting at enemy ships. The gravity was so strong it would crush most beings, said the youngest Vorthak, his voice full of pride. But we Vorthak are strong. We adapted quickly and won the battle in just 2 days. The others at the table nodded and made impressed sounds. A group of Zephyrians who looked like walking crystals that caught and reflected light began their own story about fighting in an asteroid field. Their voices sounded like wind chimes as they talked about how their ships moved between the rocks like dancers. The asteroids were moving so fast that one mistake would mean death, said their leader, a tall Zephyrian whose body was deep blue like sapphire. But our reflexes are faster than most species. We destroyed the enemy base in 3 hours. Jake took another sip of his whiskey and looked down at his worn military uniform. The fabric was faded and there were small tears in it from years of use. His boots were old and scuffed. He did not look like much compared to the shiny armor and clean uniforms of the alien soldiers around him. More stories came from different tables. A group of insect-like Krillians talked about their battle on a moon, where the temperature was so cold that metal became brittle. Some furry, bear-like Ursans described fighting in the rings of Saturn, where the ice chunks were as big as buildings. Each story seemed more impressive than the last. Jake had heard it all before. Every night the same young soldiers came to drink and tell the same kinds of stories. They always tried to make their battles sound more dangerous and exciting than they really were. Most of them had only been in 1 or 2 small fights, but they talked like they were the greatest warriors in the galaxy. The Vorthak soldiers were getting louder now. They had been drinking for a while and their voices carried across the cantina. The youngest one, who had many small scars on his arms, looked around the room until his eyes fell on Jake. "What about you, human?" the young Vorthak called out. "You have been sitting there all night without saying anything. Do you have any war stories to share?" The cantina became a little quieter as other soldiers turned to look at Jake. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for his answer. Most of them had probably never paid attention to him before. To them, he was just another human soldier. Nothing special. Jake looked up from his drink and met the Vorthak's yellow eyes. "I don't think you would want to hear my stories," he said, quietly. This made the alien soldiers laugh. The sound was strange because each species had a different way of laughing. The Vorthak made a hissing sound. The Zephyrians chimed like bells and the Krillians clicked their mandibles together. "Come on, human," said an older Vorthak with sergeant stripes on his uniform. "We have told you about fighting on gas giants and in asteroid fields. Surely you have done something interesting in your military service." Jake shook his head slowly. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." This made them laugh even more. The sergeant, whose name was Krixtal according to his uniform, stood up and walked over to Jake's table. He was much taller than Jake, and his green scales looked tough like armor. "Are you afraid to share your stories because they are not as impressive as ours?" Krixtal asked with a grin that showed his sharp teeth. "It is okay, human. Not everyone can be a great warrior." Other soldiers began to whisper among themselves. Jake could hear them making jokes about humans and how they came from only one small planet instead of a great empire that spanned many worlds. Some of them wondered out loud how humans had even made it into the Galactic Alliance military. Jake was about to take another drink when he heard familiar footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lieutenant Zara Kim walking toward his table. She was also human, with short black hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Jake had served with her before and knew she was one of the smartest officers in the intelligence division. "Evening, Jake," Zara said as she sat down at his table. She looked at the crowd of alien soldiers who were still watching them. "Making new friends?" "They want to hear war stories," Jake replied. Zara raised an eyebrow. She knew Jake's history better than most people. She had read his file and knew about his 3 tours on Earth during the Resource Wars. She also knew about his time on Mars during the Colonial Uprising, and most importantly, she knew about New Houston. "Maybe you should tell them about Earth," Zara suggested quietly. Jake looked at her with surprise. "You think they could handle it?" The alien soldiers were getting impatient. They wanted to hear what the humans were whispering about. Krixtal slammed his fist on the table, making Jake's glass jump. "Enough whispering," the Vorthak sergeant said. "If you have stories to tell, then tell them. If not, then admit that humans are not real warriors." Jake looked around the cantina. More soldiers had gathered to watch what was happening. He could see curiosity in their alien faces, but also amusement. They expected him to tell a boring story about a small skirmish or maybe admit that he had never really seen combat. Jake finished his whiskey in one gulp and set the glass down hard on the table. The sound made everyone pay attention. "All right," Jake said, his voice carrying a weight that made the cantina grow quiet. "But I'm not talking about fighting in space or on dead rocks. I'm talking about fighting on Earth." The alien soldiers exchanged glances. Earth was just one planet. They thought. How dangerous could it be? Jake leaned back in his chair and looked at the faces around him. The alien soldiers were waiting to hear what they thought would be a simple story about fighting other humans. They had no idea what was coming. "I'll start with something easy," Jake said. "The Gulf campaign during the Resource Wars. We were fighting for control of the oil platforms in what used to be called the Gulf of Mexico." The alien soldiers nodded. Fighting for resources was something they all understood. Wars were fought over valuable materials all across the galaxy. The enemy had taken control of 3 major platforms, Jake continued. Our job was to take them back. Simple enough, right? Except there was a problem. Jake paused and took a deep breath. Even now, years later, he could still remember the fear he had felt. A hurricane was coming. The Zephyrian soldiers looked confused. Their language did not have a word for hurricane. One of them, whose crystal body was pale green, spoke up. "What is a hurricane?" she asked. Jake thought for a moment about how to explain it. "Imagine a storm that covers an area bigger than most of your homeworlds. The wind moves so fast it can pick up cars and throw them around like toys. The rain falls so hard it feels like being shot with bullets. And the whole thing moves across the ocean like a giant, angry beast." The alien soldiers were quiet now. They were trying to picture what Jake was describing. "This hurricane was what we called a Category 5, Jake said. "That means the winds were moving at over 250 kilometers per hour. For most alien species, wind that fast would tear them apart." Krixtal, the Vorthak sergeant, laughed nervously. "Surely you waited for this storm to pass before beginning your mission?" Jake shook his head. "We couldn't wait. The enemy was going to destroy the platforms if we didn't stop them. So we went in anyway." The cantina was completely silent now. Even the bartender had stopped cleaning glasses to listen. "The first platform was the hardest," Jake said. "We had to approach it by boat because the storm made flying impossible. The waves were 15 meters high. Our boat was thrown around like a piece of wood. Half my squad was throwing up from seasickness, but we still had to fight." Jake rolled up his sleeve and showed a long scar on his arm. "I got this when a piece of metal roofing flew off a building and hit me. The wind was so strong it turned garbage into weapons." A Krillian soldier clicked his mandibles together in what Jake knew was a sign of nervousness among his species. "When we reached the platform, we had to climb up the side while the wind tried to blow us into the ocean," Jake continued. "The rain was coming down so hard we could barely see 5 meters in front of us, and all the time the enemy was shooting at us." "How did you fight in such conditions?" asked the Green Zephyrian. "Very carefully," Jake said. "We couldn't use most of our electronic equipment because the storm interfered with it. We had to rely on basic weapons and our training. The enemy had the same problems, but they knew the platform better than we did. Jake took a sip from a new drink that Zara had brought him. The alcohol helped him remember the details he usually tried to forget. The worst part was when the eye of the storm passed over us, he said. For about 30 minutes, everything became perfectly calm. No wind, no rain, just silence. But we knew it wouldn't last. When the other side of the storm hit, the wind would come from the opposite direction and be even stronger. What happened when the storm came back? Asked a young Ursan soldier whose fur was standing up with nervousness. Chaos, Jake said simply. Everything that wasn't tied down became a flying weapon. We had to take cover and wait for it to pass. But the enemy used that time to counterattack. So we were fighting them while metal sheets and pieces of equipment flew around us like missiles. Jake paused and looked around the room. The alien soldiers were staring at him with wide eyes. They were beginning to understand that fighting on Earth was different from fighting anywhere else. We held that platform for 6 hours while the hurricane passed over us, Jake said. When it was over, we looked like we had been through a meat grinder. But we completed the mission. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had entered the cantina while Jake was talking. She was another human veteran with short brown hair and scars on her hands. She sat down at the table and listened to the end of Jake's story. That sounds like a fun day, Lisa said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Want to tell them about the Amazon? Jake looked at her and nodded. Lisa here fought in the bio wars in South America. Lisa looked at the alien soldiers who were still trying to process Jake's hurricane story. The Amazon is a jungle that covers an area bigger than most star systems. It's full of plants and animals that have been trying to kill each other for millions of years. The Vorthak Sergeant Krixtall was beginning to look uncomfortable. Surely the plants are not dangerous. Lisa laughed, but it was not a happy sound. There are plants in the Amazon that can kill you just by touching them. Some release poison into the air that makes you blind. Others have thorns coated with toxins that cause your nervous system to shut down. She showed them a small scar on her neck. This is from a plant called a stinging nettle. Just brushing against it felt like being electrocuted. And that's one of the harmless ones. The alien soldiers were looking at each other nervously now. They were starting to realize that Earth was not like other planets they knew about. But the plants were not the worst part. Lisa continued. The animals were the real problem. Lisa was about to continue her story when Jake held up his hand. Let me tell them about Yellowstone first, he said. They need to understand what it's like when the planet itself tries to kill you. The alien soldiers looked confused. They had never heard of a planet actually fighting back against the people living on it. On their worlds, the ground stayed still and the weather was predictable. Yellowstone is a place on Earth that sits on top of something called a supervolcano, Jake began. Most planets have small volcanoes that spit out a little lava now and then. This one is different. It's big enough to destroy half a continent if it ever fully erupts. The crystalline Zephyrians made a sound like breaking glass. Their homeworld had no volcanoes at all, so the idea terrified them. We were conducting a mission there to stop enemy forces from taking control of a geothermal power plant, Jake continued. It should have been a simple operation. Get in, secure the facility, get out. But the volcano had other plans. Jake paused to take a drink. The memory was still clear in his mind even after all these years. On the second day of our mission, the ground started shaking, he said. At first, we thought it was just normal earthquake activity. Yellowstone has small earthquakes all the time, but then the shaking got stronger. How strong? Asked Krixtall, though he looked like he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Strong enough to knock you off your feet, Jake replied. The earthquake measured 7.2 on our scale. That means the ground was moving so violently that buildings collapsed and roads cracked open like broken eggs. Jake showed them another scar, this one on his forehead. I got this when the ceiling of our command post fell down during the first big shake, but we couldn't leave. The enemy was still there, and they were trying to use the chaos to escape with valuable equipment. The alien soldiers were leaning forward now, completely focused on Jake's words. They had fought in many places, but none of them had ever dealt with a planet that was actively trying to shake them to death. The worst part wasn't the earthquakes, Jake said. It was what came after. The volcano started releasing gases and ash into the air. The ash was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and breathing it was like swallowing glass. Lisa nodded in agreement. I've seen the medical reports from that operation. Half the soldiers needed treatment for lung damage. We had to wear special masks just to breathe, Jake continued. But the masks made it hard to see and hear, which made fighting much more difficult. Meanwhile, the ground kept shaking every few hours and the temperature kept changing. Changing how? Asked a Krillian soldier. One moment it would be freezing cold because the ash blocked out the sun, Jake explained. The next moment hot gases would come up from cracks in the ground and make the air so hot it burned your lungs. We had soldiers getting frostbite and heat stroke at the same time. The alien soldiers were completely silent now. They were trying to imagine fighting while the very ground beneath their feet was trying to kill them. On the fourth day, things got really bad, Jake said. A new crack opened up in the ground right through the middle of our camp. Hot water and steam shot out of it like a geyser. The water was so hot it would cook you instantly if you fell in. Jake pointed to burn scars on his hands. I got these, pulling my squad leader away from one of those steam vents. The ground was literally trying to swallow us. At that moment, Corporal Danny Walsh walked into the cantina. He was a quiet man with sandy brown hair and the kind of pale skin that showed he hadn't seen much sun lately. He sat down at the table and listened to the end of Jake's story. Sounds like you're telling them about the fun missions, Danny said with a tired smile. Danny here was at the Antarctic siege, Jake explained to the alien soldiers. Want to tell them about fighting in the cold, Danny? Danny looked at the gathering crowd of aliens and shrugged. Sure, why not? Maybe they'll understand why we humans are so hard to kill. He took a drink from Jake's glass and began his story. The Antarctic siege lasted 2 weeks. The enemy had taken control of a research station at the South Pole and were using it to coordinate attacks across the southern hemisphere. What made this mission so difficult? Asked the Green Zephyrian. The temperature, Danny said simply. It was minus 60 degrees Celsius. That's cold enough to freeze your blood solid in minutes if you're not protected. The alien soldiers looked at each other with worry. Most of their species came from warm planets where the temperature never dropped below freezing. We had to wear special suits just to survive outside, Danny continued. But the suits were bulky and made it hard to move quickly. And if your suit got damaged, you had maybe 5 minutes before the cold killed you. How did you fight in such conditions? Asked an Ursan soldier. Very carefully, Danny replied. Our weapons kept jamming because the cold made the metal parts contract and stick together. We had to keep our ammunition close to our bodies to keep it warm enough to fire. Danny showed them frostbite scars on his fingers. I lost the tips of 2 fingers to frostbite on the 3rd day, but I kept fighting because stopping meant dying. The enemy had the same problems we did, Danny said, but they had been there longer and knew the terrain better. They used the weather as a weapon against us. How? Asked Krikstal. They would attack during blizzards when we couldn't see more than a few meters, Danny explained. The wind was so strong it could knock you down, and the snow was so thick it was like trying to fight while blindfolded. Danny paused and looked around the room. On the 10th day, we ran out of fuel for our heaters. We had to huddle together for warmth while still maintaining our defensive positions. Some of my friends got so cold they started hallucinating. The alien soldiers were completely quiet now. They were beginning to understand that humans didn't just fight other humans. They fought against the planet itself, and somehow, they won. The cantina had grown crowded as word spread about the human veterans telling their Earth stories. Soldiers from different species had gathered around Jake's table, listening with growing amazement and fear. Just then, Sergeant Amy Carter walked through the crowd and sat down with the other humans. Amy was a tough-looking woman with short red hair and green eyes that had seen too much. Her arms were covered with small scars that looked like bite marks. She had been listening from the bar and decided it was time to add her own story to the mix. Are you telling them about the weather and earthquakes? Amy asked with a grin that made the alien soldiers nervous. We covered the basics, Jake replied. Want to tell them about Australia? Amy's grin got wider, but there was no humor in it. Oh, they need to hear about Australia. That's where Earth really shows you what it can do. The alien soldiers looked confused. They thought they had already heard about the worst things Earth could throw at humans. They were wrong. Australia is a continent where everything is designed to kill you, Amy began. And I mean everything. The plants, the animals, even the tiny creatures you can't see without a microscope. She rolled up her sleeve and showed them a scar that looked like a spider web on her forearm. This is from a funnel web spider bite. The spider was only about as big as my thumb, but its venom can kill a full-grown human in 15 minutes. The Krillian soldiers clicked their mandibles nervously. They were insect-like creatures, but even they were disturbed by the idea of such a deadly small predator. 15 minutes? Asked Krikstal. That seems very fast. That's if you're lucky, Amy said. Some spiders can kill you in 5 minutes, and they're everywhere. In your boots, in your sleeping bag, hanging from tree branches waiting to drop on you. She pointed to another scar on her neck. This one is from a snake called a taipan. It bit me while I was setting up communications equipment. The venom attacks your nervous system and makes you paralyzed before it kills you. The Zephyrian soldiers made their wind chime sounds of distress. On their crystal homeworld, the most dangerous creature was a small bird that ate minerals. How fast do these snakes move? Asked the green Zephyrian. Faster than most alien reflexes can track, Amy replied. They can strike and inject venom before you even know they're there. And some of them are aggressive. They don't just bite you. If you threaten them, they hunt you. Amy took a drink and continued her story. But the snakes and spiders weren't the worst part of the Australian deployment. The worst part was the crocodiles. What are crocodiles? Asked a young Ursan soldier. Amy thought for a moment about how to explain it. Imagine a lizard the size of a small spacecraft, with teeth longer than your fingers and jaws strong enough to crush metal. They live in the water and on land, and they've been perfect killing machines for millions of years. The alien soldiers were completely silent now. They were starting to understand that Earth's animals were nothing like the creatures on their peaceful homeworlds. We were conducting operations in a swamp area, Amy continued. The water was murky and you couldn't see more than a few centimeters below the surface. We knew there were crocodiles in there, but we had to cross the swamp to reach our objective. Why? Didn't you go around the swamp? Asked Krikstal. Because the enemy was using it as a hiding place, Amy explained. They knew we were afraid of the crocodiles, so they thought we wouldn't follow them in there. They were wrong. Amy showed them a long scar on her leg. I got this when a crocodile grabbed my leg while I was wading through chest-deep water. These things can stay underwater for hours, just waiting. You don't see them until they attack. How did you escape? Asked a Krillian soldier. My squad mates shot it, Amy said simply. But even after we killed it, the thing kept biting. Its jaws are designed to never let go once they grab something. Jake nodded and added his own experience. I fought in New Orleans after it was flooded. The whole city was underwater, and we had to navigate through contaminated water filled with snakes, alligators, and diseases. The water was poisoned? Asked the green Zephyrian. The flood mixed sewage, chemicals, and dead bodies together, Jake explained. Just touching the water could make you sick, but we still had to fight in it because that's where the enemy was hiding. Amy continued her story. The thing about fighting in Australia is that you're not just fighting human enemies. You're fighting an entire ecosystem that sees you as food. Every step you take, something is trying to eat you, poison you, or crush you. She pointed to a series of small scars on her arm. These are from something called bullet ants. They're called that because their sting feels like being shot. A single ant can put a grown human on the ground in pain for hours. But you still completed your missions? Asked an Ursan soldier. Of course we did, Amy said. That's what soldiers do. But we had to learn to fight the environment at the same time we fought the enemy. We had to check our equipment for spiders every morning. We had to test the ground for snakes before we stepped. We had to watch the water for crocodiles while we were being shot at. Danny Walsh spoke up from his seat. Tell them about the plants, Amy. Amy laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Oh, right, the plants. Some of them are just as dangerous as the animals. There's one called a stinging tree that can cause pain for months just from touching it. The pain is so bad that people have killed themselves to escape it. The alien soldiers were looking at each other with expressions of horror and disbelief. They had fought across the galaxy, but they had never imagined a world where the plants could torture you. There are vines that can wrap around you and squeeze you to death, Amy continued. Flowers that release gases to make you unconscious so insects can eat you while you're helpless. Trees with sap so poisonous that just breathing near them can kill you. Crixtal finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly. How did your species survive long enough to develop civilization on such a world? The question hung in the air like a challenge. All the alien soldiers were waiting for the answer. They couldn't understand how any intelligent species could evolve on a planet that was actively trying to kill them every single day. Jake looked at Crixtal and the other alien soldiers who were waiting for his answer. The question about how humans survived on Earth was not simple to answer. It required explaining something that most aliens could not understand. We didn't just survive, Jake said quietly. We became the top predator. Before he could continue, Colonel Marcus Stone walked into the cantina. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of presence that made everyone pay attention when he entered a room. As the station's human military advisor, he had heard about the storytelling session and came to see what was happening. Colonel, Jake said, standing up to salute. At ease, soldier, Marcus replied. I heard you were giving our alien friends a history lesson about Earth. The alien soldiers looked nervous. They were not sure if they were in trouble for encouraging the humans to share classified information. It's not classified, is it, sir? Jake asked. Marcus smiled and sat down at the table. Not at all. In fact, I think they need to hear the rest of the story. They need to understand why the Galactic Council has Earth classified the way it does. The alien soldiers looked confused. They had never heard of Earth having any special classification. What classification? Asked Crixtal. Marcus looked around the crowded cantina and then back at the alien soldiers. Earth is listed in the Galactic Council database as a Class 2 Deathworld. The alien soldiers went completely silent. Even the background noise in the cantina seemed to stop. Class 2 was a classification they had all heard of but never encountered. That's impossible, said the Green Zephyrian. Class 2 worlds are uninhabitable. Nothing can live on them. That's what we thought too, Marcus replied, until we discovered humans. Earth is the only known Class 2 world where intelligent life not only survived but developed advanced civilization. Marcus stood up and addressed the entire gathering. Let me explain what Class 2 means. It means a planet so hostile that the Galactic Council recommends that no species attempt to establish even research stations there. He began counting on his fingers. Extreme weather patterns that can kill most known species. Geological activity that makes the ground unstable. Aggressive flora and fauna that actively hunt intelligent beings. Atmospheric conditions that change rapidly and without warning. The alien soldiers were staring at Marcus with wide eyes. They were beginning to understand something that changed everything they thought they knew about humans. Most species in the galaxy evolved on what we classify as paradise worlds, Marcus continued.
Stable weather, peaceful animals, predictable seasons, and plants that don't try to kill you. The most dangerous thing on most alien homeworlds is bad weather that makes you uncomfortable. Amy Carter spoke up from her seat. Tell them about
the other species that tried to colonize Deathworlds, Colonel. Marcus nodded. There have been 17 attempts by various species to establish colonies on Class X through Class 3 worlds. All of them failed. Most resulted in total loss of life within the first year. But humans are different, said a Krillian soldier. Yes, we are, Marcus replied. But not because we're stronger or smarter than other species. We're different because Earth taught us to be different. Jake stood up and continued the explanation. Every challenge on Earth made us adapt or die. The hurricanes taught us to build stronger shelters and work together during disasters. The earthquakes taught us to be flexible and quick to respond to changes. Amy added her part. The predators taught us to be constantly alert and to think like hunters ourselves. The poisonous plants taught us to be careful and to test everything before we trusted it. Danny spoke up as well. The extreme cold and heat taught us to prepare for anything and to never give up, even when conditions seem impossible. Marcus looked around the room at all the alien faces staring at the humans. You see, what you think of as weaknesses are actually our greatest strengths. You come from peaceful worlds with vast space empires. We come from one small planet that tried to kill us every day of our lives. That's why human military units are so effective, Jake said. We're not fearless. We just define dangerous very differently than you do. When you've survived childhood on Earth, everything else seems manageable. Crixtal finally spoke, his voice full of newfound respect. That's why human troops are always requested for the most dangerous missions. Exactly, Marcus replied. Other species see a toxic atmosphere or unstable terrain and think it's impossible. We see Tuesday afternoon. Lisa Rodriguez, who had been quiet for a while, stood up and added, Earth didn't just make us tough, it made us adaptable. We can survive in any environment because we learned to survive in all environments. The alien soldiers were looking at the humans with complete amazement now. They finally understood why humans seemed so calm in situations that terrified other species. They realized that human military training wasn't about learning to be soldiers. It was about learning to be even better survivors than they already were. Marcus looked at his watch and realized how late it had gotten. Well, this has been educational, but I think it's time for everyone to get some rest. As the alien soldiers began to leave the cantina, they walked differently than when they had arrived. They no longer saw the humans as inferior beings from a single small planet. They saw them as graduates of the universe's most challenging survival course. Crixtal approached Jake before leaving. I have one more question, he said. If Earth is so dangerous, why do humans miss it when they're deployed, away from home? Jake smiled for the first time that evening. Because it's home, and because once you've survived a hurricane while being shot at by enemy forces, everything else in the galaxy seems easy. The Vorthak sergeant nodded slowly and walked away, finally understanding why humans were so valuable to the Galactic Alliance military. As the cantina emptied, the human veterans sat together in comfortable silence. They had shared their stories and helped their alien comrades understand what it meant to be human. In the days that followed, word of their conversation spread throughout the station and beyond. The alien recruits who had heard the stories began requesting assignment to human units not for glory, but to learn from beings who had already graduated from the hardest school in the galaxy, growing up on Earth.